Hey, I'm Pastor Stephen. Welcome to our brand new study. We're going to call it Counterculture. We're going to go through the book of Daniel, and I'm excited about this study as we follow the life of Daniel and how his life takes so many shifts, so many turns, and he goes through scenarios that might just be something that we may be facing, maybe not exactly what he's doing, but something that might relate to what we're going through in our personal lives. Let me ask you though, have you ever maybe gone to a new school or been around people that you didn't know, or been in a situation or in an environment that you felt uncomfortable because you felt like you didn't belong? Maybe you felt like a stranger going to a new place. Maybe you've moved from a new town or from where you used to live to a new town. How did you feel? How did it feel to be to feel like a stranger? And that's what we're going to see in Daniel's life today as we talk about Daniel being a stranger in a strange land. And our main idea for our study today is that sometimes what is accepted as normal is not always right. So as we begin in chapter 1, we're going to take a look at our culture and how our culture has rapidly been changing. Some would say it's adapting, while others would say that our culture is finally changing for the better. And it depends on what your perspective is of our culture. As 2020 quickly is coming to an end, it is important to understand that our current culture that we live in is not a culture defined and developed by God, but is a culture that is developed by the need for happiness, self-recognition, success, and popularity. And our culture, and basically the culture is the standard or the belief system and the way of living that a group of people have. And so when we talk about our culture, we're talking about the overall culture of our country and the culture of where we live, and the culture of your school, the culture of your family, the culture of your workplace, or wherever you may be. That is the culture we're talking about. So there are two different types of cultures that we talk about: the culture of the world, and then the culture that Christianity or God has developed and defined by His standards and His values. So as we go through the book of Daniel, we're going to discuss what it means to go against the culture of this world, a counterculture, if you will, one that is defined and developed by God. So as we begin our journey with Daniel, we see Daniel is faced with an impossible situation. In verse 1 of chapter 1, it says, "During the third year of King Jehoiakim's reign in Judah, the king of Babylon, King Nebuchadnezzar, came to Jerusalem, besieged it. The Lord gave him victory over King Jehoiakim of Judah and permitted him to take some of the sacred objects from the temple of God. So Nebuchadnezzar took them back to the land of Babylonia and placed them in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select, he says, the only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men. He says, make sure that they will be well-versed in every branch of learning, gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon." So we see here that Daniel, and as we're going to see, his three friends, most of us know them as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we're going to talk about their Hebrew names here in a little bit. But we see that they were taken from their homeland. They were taken from Judah, the children of Israel, brought into a foreign land, brought into a land that was not their home. See, Daniel and his three friends were taken from their homes. Why? Why did this happen? Why did they get to the point where they are now? See, Judah, the country of Israel at that time, had disobeyed God, and as a result, God had allowed their enemy, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, to be victorious over God's people. God had shown Himself over and over throughout the Old Testament how God was there for His people. He gave them victory over their enemies, but in this very moment, they had turned their backs on God so many times that God had allowed their enemies to become victorious. So Daniel found himself a stranger in a strange land. And so as we saw that the king had instructed his chief of staff to take these young men and to train them in Babylonian culture, in their language and customs and everything, so that they could serve the king in his royal palace or be on the royal staff. So what I want to propose is when the expectations of culture collide with the expectations of God, you find out what you truly believe. Look at verses 3 again. It says, the king ordered his chief of staff to bring them to Babylon as captives. He says, select only the strong, healthy, and good-looking young men. He says, make sure that they are well-versed in every branch of learning, gifted with knowledge and good judgment, and are suited to serve the royal palace. Train them in the language and literature of Babylon. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from his own kitchens, and they were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter into the royal service. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. They changed their names. It says the chief of staff renamed them with Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belshazzar. Hananiah was called Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach. And Azariah was called Abednego. So all of these Hebrew children had been taken into captivity, were being tested. What seemed like a dream now became a reality. The king ordered his chief of staff to prepare the new arrivals for 3 years. They were told how to speak. They were told what to wear, what to eat, and even their names were changed to Babylonian names. Imagine what this might have been like. A stranger in a strange land. And now their whole way of life was being challenged. They were being told what they were to wear, what they were to say, what they were to eat, how they were to act. Their whole identity was now being transformed into the identity of the Babylonians. And so their culture, their values, their very integrity was at stake. So they lost their families, they lost their home, everything they had ever known or cared about, taken from their own country to a foreign land and forced to become something or someone that they were not. All to satisfy a king that took them away from all they had ever known. Now, we might not have been taken from our country or our families, but our current culture has been shaped in a way where the expectations of our culture collides with the expectations of God. And how we handle ourselves is very important. So as we continue in our story, I want to propose again here that when culture challenges you, you challenge culture. Daniel, it says in verse 8, was determined to not defile himself by eating the food and wine given by the king. It says that they were to be tested for 3 years, to be trained for 3 years, and to be fed only the king's wine and only the king's food. What Daniel was saying here is that his convictions about God and his integrity were more important than allowing the simple pleasures of this world to put a stain on them. And it wasn't that the king's wine and the king's food was necessarily bad, but it was going against what he had been taught. It was going against his personal convictions and his personal beliefs. Daniel was a Hebrew, and he was not going to allow the influences of the Babylonian culture to change who he was. He was going to challenge back. As he was being challenged on what he believed, he was going to challenge back with what he believed. He suggested to the chief of staff, he says, for 10 days, let me and my 3 friends only eat vegetables and drink water. And he says after 10 days that he and his friends would be healthier, sober, and more presentable than all the others that ate the king's food and drank the king's wine. So there was this challenge. He challenged them. And after he was right. After the 10 days, Daniel and his friends were able to continue with their convictions for the remainder of the 3 years because, as we see here in verse 17, God gave these 4 men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom, and God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams. We go back to verse 16. It says, so after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of food and wine provided for the others. Why? Look at verse 15. And after the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. See, just because it might be normal in culture, just because it is accepted as right, does not always mean it is the right thing. And that is what it means to go against culture, have a counterculture in your life, is to take your personal convictions about what God has and what God is trying to teach you, and you hold true to those things. We see in verses 18 through 21, it says, after 3 years, it says that the king was so impressed by Daniel and his 3 friends that he placed them directly into his royal service. Because they refused to give up on their personal convictions, on their personal values and their integrity, and give into the culture that they were being thrust into, that they found themselves, that they did not ask to be in. And you might be in a place where the cultures and the influence of this world are beating you down and you have no say on it. You just live here. And our culture is constantly changing and may not be for the best. There are things that are going to challenge our convictions about what we believe as Christians, and your personal convictions, your personal values, your personal faith is going to be challenged, and you need to challenge back. Just because it's accepted as normal does not make it right. I'm not saying that if you eat vegetables and drink water for 3 years, everything is going to work out for you. What I'm saying is just because it is normal for our culture to pursue happiness, self-recognition, success, and popularity at the cost of integrity and convictions, it is not always right. Staying true to God is more noble than aligning with a culture that defines Him. It is also the smarter play to follow God and not man. So think about where you stand in our current culture today. As we dive deeper into Daniel's story, I hope and pray that God speaks to you and that you become stronger in your faith and ready to stand firm in your convictions and integrity in Christ. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next week.